Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comet Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and as you all well know by now, this season we are exploring the texture of something at once precious, yet suspiciously ordinary, and that is the relationship of friendship. I've tried thus far on this podcast to introduce you to wisdom, both profound and practical, regarding what friendship is and requires, what it looks like within a marriage, how it changes over distances, both geographic and temporal. Today, I'd like to introduce you to another layer, and that is the beauty of friendship that blossoms across race and cultural heritage. Otis Pickett and Deshawn Dyson are both historians, one white, one black, whose vocations as scholars, teachers, husbands, and fathers find much to reverberate in the friendship they've cultivated over the years. They're also both Southerners, and I met them in Jackson, Mississippi earlier this year on the third day of a pilgrimage I took with a special group curated by organizations named Telos, Erebon, and the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship through the scarred history of American slavery and then the Civil Rights Movement. It was still early in this week-long journey when my traveling group met Otis and Deshawn for lunch. We were, I think, all of us, beginning to descend into a stillness of pain and reckoning, perhaps even feeling the seeds of distrust and some fear germinate in our own racial mix as a group as we steeped in almost incalculable stories of oppression and cultural robbery, cruelty and government-sanctioned racial hierarchies. Sitting down relatively quietly, exhausted but grateful for the distraction of very sweet, sweet tea, we were gently uplifted by the sharing of two guys who knew this history better than most of us, knew it in their respective families, knew it in their scholarship, but probably more importantly, just their everyday lives. Somehow, without sugarcoating or giving false hope, these two, both what they shared and how they shared it, moved me deeply, giving me a fresh model of what may be the only way out through the present national morass of distrust and unhealed wounds. And that is friendship, and the witness in particular of their friendship. I invited them on here today to replay a little bit of that same grace that descended on me back in April. A little vocational bio. Otis is newly the university historian at Clemson University, where he will be responsible for compiling and disseminating new scholarship relating to Clemson's past, as well as serving as a resource on issues of historic interpretation, representation, and commemoration for the Clemson community. He was previously a professor of history at Mississippi College in Clinton, Mississippi. And Deshawn is the founding head of school at the Redeemer School in Jackson, as well as an assistant professor of teacher education and leadership at Mississippi College. Deshawn, Otis, thank you both for carving out time and trust to join me on the podcast today.
I can barely speak. That was so beautiful.
Oh.
What a kind introduction.
Well, you guys made a deep impression on me, so thank you. So as I just said, I met you both in the context of the deep, deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. You sort of both generously shared a bit about your friendship, but also your respective lives and how they intersected. I was hoping you might be willing to just retell a bit of that tale to our podcast listeners today. Like, what have been the individual roads that led to encountering and then befriending one another?
I don't have a very typical, or maybe it is in some ways typical experience in the South for a white male. But I was raised in a home that was very open, and we were taught and modeled to love people that we came across. And we were also very intentionally in our home had multi-ethnic friendships. And that was something very intentional that my mom kind of embedded in me from a very young age. And I watched her do it. And I'm very much like my mother. And So when we came to Jackson, we were very excited because we had never had a church family that was multi-ethnic or that had, even in the U.S. South, a sizable percentage of African Americans that attended the church. And so um, my wife and I were just so excited when we came to Redeemer Church in Jackson and met the Dysons at a small group. And Deshaun and I were standing in the kitchen eating, and we started talking history and politics and theology and Marvel and and as I listened to him talk, I just said, man, he doesn't know it yet, but this guy and I are going to be best friends. And we've been best friends for 9 years. I mean, Deshaun is my best friend, the person I talk to every day, pretty much, and process everything with. And when we can do things together, there's no one I'd rather do things professionally with, speaking with. That was 2013.
Thanks. Deshaun, what's your way into this?
So I'll say for me, the composition of my life is not unique, but the story is unique. I'll tell folks that to be Black in the South and to try to exist in a way that you're around resources and people often means that you're existing around white people. And so that was something that I just figured out from my parents. They had jobs around white people and they wanted to go to a school district with resources. For me, it was always this double-edged sword of I didn't necessarily acquaint intimacy with proximity. So I could always just be around white people and exist and have conversations. And so when I met Otis, it was, as he said, in a small group. We had ended up at a multi-ethnic, multiracial church, which was a function of what was probably a budding, emerging conviction, which I'll say today, I have none of this figured out. I've probably progressed in some areas and regressed in some areas on how I view some of these things. But having graduated college and picked up some social, theological convictions and complexions about myself, we found ourselves at this church and tried to be full participants. But I'm probably, and Otis can attest to this, someone by nature who, although I exist in very public-facing spaces, so we met, for example, in a place where I was in front of people, and I'm a talker, I'm a presenter. But the second you get me away from that, I'm typically hiding from folks.
I resonate.
And so to exist in especially multi-ethnic spaces, you tend to, if you look like me, draw a lot of attention towards yourself. And so I became very good at learning how to minimally engage. I could have conversations and be nice and polite, but also keep it moving. And so it's always something I can discern very quickly if I stick around. My wife makes she makes fun of me because I'll be in the car and be like, oh, well, I gotta go get the juice out the cupboard now. And she's like, what does that even mean? Well, I just needed to go. I just needed to get away. And Otis is one of those moments where, we're sitting there talking and I'm not trying to leave. Like, I'm not trying to get away from the person who they're being authentic and they're being intimate. And they really have a desire to know more about me. But I was reciprocating. I was interested in a little bit about not just MLK, but some of the nuance. And that grew into a more textured, nuanced friendship that spanned not just super serious stuff, but maybe it's video games, maybe it's sports, maybe it's half of the characters and figurines that I'm drinking from a Ravenclaw cup that was purchased for me by Otis. And so and this isn't a necessity, but it's a reality that Black folks often have to navigate. White people feeling comfortable around you is a skill to have. And learning how to growing intimacy around people with that being a reality is something when I detected like, oh no, this is a real intimate friendship. That budded a long time ago, and it's grown into something to where we've navigated a lot of life, through that.
Well said.
Very well said. Actually working on this magazine issue on friendship, trying to cultivate conversations around it, as it feels like post-pandemic that a lot of people are reevaluating their relationships and things have gotten scrambled. A lot of people have moved, all that. And I think one thing that has struck me is like these rich, often long-lasting friendships are often layered by a lot of other common questions, even if you're coming from very different coordinates. And you two both, even if you've had slightly different kind of career paths, it feels like the sort of both historical interests you've had, as well as the kind of metal you've put into your own learning, and then how you're deploying that in your vocations as teachers and so on, has been very kind of overlapping. Could you describe a little bit of how you each got into your particular kind of areas of interest, academically, professionally, and if that does also like intersect as a thread in your own conversations with each other over the years?
I come from a family of educators. My parents, my siblings, I didn't want to be a teacher. I wanted to be a lawyer, make a lot of money, and have a lot of things. And I think it's a combination of probably three things. My great-grandfather, who is a hero to me and someone who I love dearly, was a World War II veteran. And I can recall very distinctly, one, sitting at his lap and hearing the stories of his service in New Guinea and how the version of history and military service that he told is not the version that I would hear often as we celebrate service and celebrate the unity of military and all those other things, that he was able to articulate what it meant to be a serviceman and what it meant to fight for country and go, but to still distinctly have these racial issues that were, defining him more than other things. And so as I, just had this very complex view of the world, even as I teach my kids about issues, I have friends that tell me like, because I kind of burden them by just not letting them view a world simply, as opposed to deconstructing it later, right? when the world happens. And so my father, who also has military service experience as a history teacher, I just grew up the child of the civil rights movement. And so as much as I was hearing about, the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan and the Dallas Cowboys, it was Medgar Evers and Margaret Walker Alexander and all these other folks. And so my life was just peppered with these people, and I was given a context for how you are who you are, and this place is what it is because of these nuances. And so as I kind of had in my origins, I think I'm different. I think the world's different. And so I kind of, as a sixth grader, had declared the world post-racial because I met white people and they were very different from what I thought my parents were describing. And then sort of earning those wounds of my own and seeing the world, for myself, that not only was that history more complex than I could probably understand as I was growing into it, but I think the world has proven, sin has proven that there was not only wisdom in my parents helping me navigate and see those things, but there's a perpetual reality to these systems that if we don't address and attend to them with nuance, then they'll continue to fail and harm people. And so that was sort of my upbringing in the culture of civil rights and a system of people who valued history and valued how you look at systems, and how I think the Lord wired me and called me to stay on that trajectory. And there's still plenty of work to be done there. So I felt plenty fulfilled to stay there.
Huh. So, Ann, I just wanted to start by saying what an insightful question that is. I don't think we often get in our society how driven we are by history and how driven we are by personal history and the context in which we grew up, and our family history, and how our identities are shaped by that deeply. Most of the students I've taught, ideologies come straight from their parents, not what they're reading. And most of the way people see the world are at the dinner table, right? And the people they're engaging with growing up, and the intentionality with which families have of what they value. I was very blessed and had a very unique upbringing where we lived in a very multi-ethnic community. My grandfather was a physician in that community, and most of his patients were African-American, Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And my grandfather had a profound love and respect for all people. And I got to see that, and I got to see him model that and practice it. And I wanted to always be like him. When he died, there was an article that appeared in the newspaper that said that he left a legacy of love. And as I meet people, I want them to feel loved and cared for. I don't have the medical degree like he did, but I like to think that I can engage with people in a way that they feel cared for. And that's what I learned from him. And then my mother was very much like that. My mother is probably the person who has shaped me the most in my life. I was an only child, so daily going with her to places, and she didn't know a stranger. She was hugging people. She was finding out how they were related. She was, this is a Southern South Carolina thing. And sometimes I'd get frustrated because we'd end up in the grocery store parking lot talking to somebody for 45 minutes. And and that's just my mom. And so, but that just rubbed off on me being around her. And my mom had us in a prayer group with an African-American pastor in Charleston in the 80s and 90s. And we ended up attending that church, and he became my pastor. And he was training me to be a pastor. He was teaching me about how to preach. He was teaching me about how to care for people in the hospital. He would take me with him on ministry visits. He would tell us his concoctions for making tea to soothe his throat after he preached, and came up to visit me in college once a semester, and prayed for me, and came to the hospital when my back was broken. And so when I was watching South Carolina go through the Confederate flag controversy in 2000, and seeing how that deeply pained my pastor, and I had grown up in a context that really celebrated the Confederacy and the Civil War, I began to think to myself, why did we not learn about the experiences of African American people in South Carolina? And why have I not thought through this? Like, what's shaping our systems of education, and why are churches so segregated? And that question of segregation in churches drove me to my research. And so I write about churches that were integrated in the 19th century and during Reconstruction, and that separated along racial lines in the late 1880s and 1890s. And I was really interested in why that happened. And then one of the last times Herman and I spoke was the day of the Emanuel AME massacre, which many of those folks he grew up with, co-labored with and co-pastored with. And so, man, just seeing the continued death and suffering of enslaved African people in the 19th century, only to be freed in the latter part of the 19th and then into the 20th century, to see that suffering and oppression continue and to be recreated, and to see what African Americans have gone through post-World War II up to the present, and then particularly the last 10 to 15 years, as this is just continuous. I got to a place in my research and in my public life, I was just sick of it.
Yeah.
And this can't go on anymore in our society. So for me, that experience, the people in my life, those experiences drove me to my research. It wasn't like I was sitting around reading huge piles of books and as I was a 12-year-old reading history. It was meeting people and engaging with people and seeing history enacted currently in our landscape and wanting to understand how that happened. And how we understand that helps us better undo it.
Part of what I've sort of had to learn the last few years with a broader national reckoning around our history, and then specifically, I grew up overseas, and I feel like an ongoing student perplexed by Christianity's shape in America. And now after this trip through some of the terrain you both know so well, I was like, oh, there's like a whole Confederate piece here that's like very helpful to understanding what all's going on more broadly. Another piece that moved me about the two of you is we met someone many years ago who said, you can tell someone who's been truly transformed, like Christianly speaking, like if they have the real disease or not. I think we were talking about like denominations, like certain kinds of Catholics versus certain kinds of quote evangelicals versus, and he was like, I don't really care about all the theological dividing lines. You can just usually tell, do they have the real disease? And both of you, I was like, they have the real disease. Mm-hmm. As people of faith who, it sounds like met each other in a church context, and yet you also study, Otis, in your case, you study kind of this fascinating thing that was like initial integration to segregation in the late 19th century. And you're both probably overly familiar with Southern Christianity and its flavor in both white and Black communities. Could you just educate a little for our listeners how you define civil religion, which is a phrase bandied about a lot when we talk about sort of American history and American sort of peculiarity, but how that manifests in the South in particular. I just would love for you to tease out the nuances between religion being used and how it's been used and often manipulated. And then the sort of the discernment process of also the great gift of faith and healing and redemption in this ongoing story.
I got to say, best ever podcast I've ever been on in terms of questions. Okay, so that journey started for me in seminary, reading Robert Bella's work on American civil religion as a concept, and particularly reading about how presidents after Abraham Lincoln began intentionally using religion in their speeches, in their rhetoric, in their publications to motivate constituents to support them. The more I began to study and the more I began to work with Charles Wilson, who writes about the civil religion in the South and the lost cause as a civil religion, the more I was able to understand the depths to which white Christianity in America is shaped by politics and vice versa. Christianity is distinct in every country and region of the world. There are some key tenets that we can all agree on, but the way that the church is formulated and the way that it practices and the way that it thinks through theology is deeply, deeply affected by its own culture and the laws and the societies and the economy that all drive people to interpret Christianity through the lens of whatever is helping them survive or develop. And so one thing we need to understand about American Christianity is that it is uniquely shaped by a colonial experience that is concerned with survival, that is concerned with economic development, that sees slaveholding as something that is protected and God-sanctioned, that is often justifying what's happening in our society biblically in order to continue to function the way that we're functioning without questioning the way that we're doing things. It's not as if Christians are being shaped by church history and a deep view of Scripture. They're actually being shaped by their context and they use scripture to justify whatever their context is happening. Okay. And then you have a situation where you've got an unholy syncretism of a absolute belief in political power as God's blessing in your life and as a way to begin to shape the United States as a city on a hill, as a representative of Christendom to the rest of the world. And political power becomes to shape the white Christian experience as something that Christians have to have. And so you begin to see overt attempts by the church to justify whatever's happening politically around them as interpreting it as, well, this is how God intended it. And so for me, we see that expressly in the idea of something about the Confederacy, of the idea of the institution of slavery, the idea that the Confederacy was God's chosen people, that he was pleased with the South and its connection and care for the church and its love of God and its love of theology. And therefore, the way that Christians were living in the South was so deeply connected with their politics that the two cannot be extricated from one another. And so when we try to act like we aren't political in the church, it's preposterous. We've always been political. I think Alexis de Tocqueville one time said, politics in America is a religion.
Yeah.
Every American at some level, every single American at some level thinks, I am an individualistic, autonomous political entity, and I could run for office one day. And so how can you not, in this society, take that into your church? How can you not interpret what's happening biblically or in the sermons or with that lived experience? And so to me, civil religion is a syncretism. It is an unhealthy connection between a political ideology and bringing that political ideology into the church via rituals, language, symbols, memorials, overt mentions of it in sermons.
Nostalgia.
Nostalgia, absolutely. And then the church becomes a vehicle that's manipulated by political parties. And political parties know what to say to come into a white conservative Christian church and say, this is what we're about. And the church has been manipulated. The church has been led along on a leash by the political parties for 2 centuries. And what we should have been doing is saying, actually, we're just going to live out what's in the Bible, and you have to justify to us why we should come and support you. Instead, we just take our marching orders.
I remember at the end of your sort of presentation to our group, you said something, it was like an ellipses statement, like there's some really special, interesting stuff happening in Mississippi. It seemed to hint at the Holy Spirit moving in a way that was giving you renewed hope.
I will say that what I'm continually blown away by, I always start with my own conviction. I'll have like a neighbor who I wave at for a year and they don't wave back at me. And I get really, really offended. And I make up this narrative about why they're such a jerk and why nothing's changed. And then I find out that they had a stroke and that they have lost mobility in their arm. And I'm like, I'm such a bleep. And I end up going to their house and like they were a professor and they're just the kindest, sweetest. And it's just like the urging of the Holy Spirit to was actually that led me to do this, that led them to do this. And this active calling to pursue and to push and to turn conviction back onto myself, even if I don't believe the other party is deserving of it because of some real or perceived slight, which will often reveal that my sin and that my problematic tendencies are sufficient to cause me, whether it be on how I deal with someone who may be in a situation, or maybe universally are more marginalized than me. It's hard to be people of hope when you have so many, indicators of the world falling down around you. But what when you do see the true disease, when you do see someone who had no reason to die, like they had no reason to cross that bridge, they had no reason to, in this idea of meekness, this idea of suffering and of taking on poverty, yourself so that someone else could gain. When you see demonstrations of that, I don't think that you expect to see this widespread growth of it. But I think that if we're faithful as individuals to take on the charge, it happened to me. I can't remember why it happened, but I had a similar occurrence where something like that happened to me again. I'm like, man, I've got so many problematic things about myself that I could be inspecting and investigating. But then you also have on the other side where, to our historical point, where you've got that the church has aligned itself with power, and the church as an institution has power. And so it has to be a vehicle of goodness and grace and of love and of care. I think it becomes more urgent that those institutions that have both the framework and the charge and the declared paramount objective of doing those things, because I'm changing in the past, and if I get 50 more years, I'm sure I'll be a totally different person. But like every time you've talked today, I've like wanted to cry because even even your articulation of these things, one of Otis and I's common loves. So the Civil War and a lot of the intimacy of those friendships and how they've dated poorly. Like we read those relationships now of how those men and women talked about each other, and we make those relationships like unnatural and sexual, where in reality, there was just an intimacy and a love and a care for one another that was common. But even still, it didn't cross every barrier. And so I think the complexity of the ways that we harm each other and hurt each other is a phenomenon that is so widespread that I think it's hard to be hopeful. But you do have those moments of, for me, it's seeing where I've grown, seeing where I've learned to be more loving and kind, and someone's graciousness and kindness allowed me to be forgiven in that moment. And to have the lone perspective of, you see like a Bill Russell dies. You just remember that there was someone who for decades was taking these steps, places that we today articulate as being difficult and hard, that there are people who've been walking in these spaces for literally, 60, 70 years. And so, my hopefulness is always, as much of a system person as I am, I'm more of a system attacker than I am a system believer and truster. But I do believe in the regenerative power of what individuals who are changed and motivated. And when the mobilization happens, I believe that's a powerful effect that can transform people and places.
Can I add something to that? Very well said. I say this just because I'm writing an article on it right now. We're working on a book on lament as a pedagogical practice, and my belief is that Mississippi, of any state in the country, probably has the most to lament and grieve, and of any state in the country has the people who've suffered the most. Just a great amount of suffering that I could spend the rest of the time of this podcast enumerating. that's still ongoing. And the overwhelming percentage of those people who are suffering are people of color in Mississippi. And I believe that the Holy Spirit attends to people in suffering, that God sees people in their suffering, that he cares about suffering, and that he pours out his Spirit in a way that is uncommon in that context. And I think there's something that's happening in Mississippi, that God is choosing people who are in need of his grace and his Spirit to meet them with that. And I've never been anywhere in this country that matches the things that are happening, whether it's through relationships, whether it's through organizations, whether it's through the classroom, whether it's in churches, whether it's in community engagement. There is a Spirit being poured out that to name it in our society would be, you are crazy for thinking that. So I got the disease, don't I? But I think when you look at how God sees things in his word, he chooses Israel of all the nations. He chooses the least of Jesse's sons. He chooses Nazareth to make his power great and his name great to work in. So it's not about the people. It's about what he does in the people. And so I think we as a nation have a lot to learn from Mississippi. And what we've done is we've made Mississippi America's scapegoat. And we said everything bad about us is down there. And we look down our pious noses because we've developed economically and new South economic development and all this stuff. What we really need to be doing is going to Mississippi and learning from people and thanking them.
Yeah.
And so I just felt the need to say that.
Thank you.
I'll tell you, I've watched as political conversations, we often lead the nation in sound bites about commentary and all those things. And what will get lost is, in terms of face-to-face, diverse, dynamic interaction, you're going to have a hard time in a 50-mile radius getting the population sample that you're going to accomplish and achieve here. And so I think that's a grace. I think that's a blessing that, the neighbor who I'm telling you about, the reason that I ended up over there was after the shooting at the temple in Pittsburgh.
Oh, wow.
They're Jewish. And so our family wrote him a card and walked down the street and said, hey, this feels clumsy and awkward, but I know that whenever we experience crisis, it impacts our family. Like it makes us feel some kind of way. And they became the most hospitable people. And that's where we found out, yeah, my husband's been sick, but we always see you and your kids. And it's just on this street in Jackson, you've got, retired this and this and this and this. And so there's access, and you have room for conflict, and you have a bubbling over of a lot of these things that, because we can name them here, it becomes sort of the mantra of what it is to be here. But I think it's a grace that my wife says this, that sometimes, one of the biggest blessing of sin is for it to be exposed. Because an exposed sin is a sin that can be dealt with. And I think that's one of the things that lament only comes after a proper recognition. And that is, my lack of hope, I think, may just be the proper sitting place for someone who is in deep lament for the real interaction I have around these things, where in the abstract, you may be able to talk about it philosophically and theologically in a way that's not really connecting with the lived experiences of people.
That's right. That's right. Amen. just mentioned a word, Deshawn, in your story, this word hospitable. And I want to talk a bit about that because when you guys, even in this conversation, have invoked traits or a vision of living that you admire, I'm hearing notes of like, what is true solidarity and the necessity of suffering with and laying down one's life. As someone who like really believes in the power of hospitality, especially in a suspicious age that we seem to be living through in this country, I was humbled, especially being down south, by the ways in which hospitality itself can be used as a cudgel of power in funky ways. And I don't really have great understanding, just sort of intuitions around this. And so I just would love to hear you reflect on what true hospitality is, either as you've experienced its false and damaging modes, particularly in the Southern fragrance, but also its melting, beautiful, transformative modes. Like what is true hospitality and what is false hospitality, and how does this all look, particularly down there?
Part of my job is there's a professor piece, but there's also the admin. And I work in development. I work in donor cultivation, relationship cultivation, partnership cultivation. And I love people, but that often positions me where like I've had to end up in like country clubs and like big fancy parties. And I'm always super uncomfortable. If you want to see me cringe, put me around a bunch of people and expensive things, because I just, regardless of what you do to make me feel comfortable there, it just feels just out of my element. And
that's when you're going to look for random juice in the cupboard or something, right?
I know. I think
I got to go check on my juice.
Yeah, my phone is blinking. I got to go. And so when I think that term has become a action verb for the things you do to be proper host, where there's a spirit of receiving people. There's a spirit of laying down preferences. There's a spirit of accepting and of being willing to ultimately, through me and through my service to you, a bigger thing than us. And it's just a much more intimate, intrusive than, I think about, The Crown. I've talked about this before. This has heard me like preach a sermon on this. Like the stately dinner where you have all these pieces, where there's like really complicated view of hospitality, where my dad's a country preacher, where you've, drive 100 miles and like their hospitality look like they just want you. They want you there so badly. It's not about what they had. It was a spirit of being received. And so I've had a hard time making that jump, because I still am just super aware of how I don't fit in. And maybe it's in my head. Maybe I look fine in the suit and talking to people. But my spirit is very uneasy in those situations, where I think hospitality is a spiritual gift and a spiritual act.
And that uneasiness is probably telling you something true. I think that's discernment, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in the land of manners in Charleston, South Carolina. And manners are a way, coming from the Tidewater, Virginia area in the 17th century, they're a way of creating social hierarchies. And so you invite people into your home, and those people break the manner codes unwittingly. And it's a way for the person in power to discern what is their upbringing, what is their background, can they be in the social hierarchy, and it's proximity to information. So you invite people into your home to learn about them, right? With the with the facade of I'm being welcoming, but it's really like, what are you doing down here? Who are you? With some sweet tea and cornbread. And so what I think the spirit of Deshaun is talking about, I always think of Jesus at the meal at the table, and the woman breaking the spikenard on his feet, and the odor filling the room, and the men asking questions. Why are you engaging this woman? And and he's just saying, she's given everything for me. She wants me so bad to be here, and she wants me. And that I get that kind of inviting spirit is what Deshaun was saying about people wanting his dad to come so bad. And so I think hospitality, biblical hospitality, Christian hospitality in the South, I don't think we throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, let's get rid of hospitality and the manners and all that. I think we can practice true hospitality, which is our home a respite? Is it a place of peace? Is it a place of rejuvenation? Are you encouraged? Are you protected? Are you advocated for? Do you feel cherished and valued as a child of God, made in God's image in our home? Are our meals nourishing, or do our meals hurt your allergies? Do our policies in our city want you here, encourage you to be here, or do our policies in our city make you feel like you're not wanted? What can I then begin to do as your neighbor to advocate in our city? What symbols in our state make you feel like you're not a neighbor, like you're not a person who belongs here? What can I do to love you, to go and try to change that? And so I think hospitality starts at the dinner table and then goes into our street, as Deshaun has so well articulated, and then goes into our neighborhoods and into our towns. And that's what we can control. And those are the spaces you're talking about. Like, we don't have these spaces. We want all this change on the landscape, but we don't want to do it in our neighborhoods and in our towns. Right. And that's what we all need to be doing. And that's the simplicity that God calls us to. But we think we have to go figure everything out nationally or internationally. And we're really just kind of practicing simple things that the Lord has asked us to do. Another thing is, like, do you have images in your home that are hurtful to people? What might those be? That someone comes in your home and they're kind of going, well, don't think I'm coming back here. In the South, you can have a lot of those and not even realize it because it's part of the culture in which you were raised. So anyway, I think hospitality can be done really, really well. And I like that we're known for hospitality. But in Mississippi and in South Carolina, a lot of folks come down to these states expecting something. And South Carolinians and Mississippians know that. And so they go out of their way to be welcoming and inviting, but it's very surface.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Once that relationship gets down to, I have to cut out some of these relationships up here so that we are to get, then it becomes something that you just really don't have time for. And it's like, how can we make space and room and cut some things out for those relationships that we really need to be doing?
You guys are both like wisdom sprinkler systems. When you call each other up, are you just like tossing like the wisdom ball one to the other, Or I hope you have some shallow conversations. That was great for both of you.
Actually, we mostly talk about Meek and Korg and Infinity War.
We quote Marvel and
Perfect. Okay, it makes me feel slightly better. Okay, good.
That's right. We have a running Meek and Korg dialogue with Thor as well.
Good. Well, final question here. Could you each just name what has been one of the most important things you've learned from the other in your friendship thus far? Or, if you could name one of the greatest graces of this friendship. And I think just more broadly, we've been talking a little bit about across sort of racial, cultural heritage and so on. But there's also something special and unique, and I think importantly, modeling just about male friendship these days, which a lot of people seem hungry to try to recover and figure out.
In a space that we don't have time to elaborate, I've gone through a really difficult past. I was placed on a medical leave with severe anxiety, depression that was giving me seizures that looked like strokes and heart attacks. Was in really, really, really bad shape. And part of it was just stress and just a lot on me. But part of it was, I was reading the Harry Potters. Again, shout out to Otis of the Ravenclaw. I talked about Harry Potter for years, and finally, my wife and some friends convinced me to read it. And the book was really helpful in like this inner turmoil that Harry was experiencing. That like, you all say you care about me, but nobody's here, and it made me realize how much I struggled to like express the depths of how bad I was hurting in that season. And Otis is just uniquely a person who was just always here for it. It feels really awkward and uncomfortable to lament. Like if you're struggling and suffering, it is a really needed but really awkward thing to just tell someone, like, I just feel really bad. I'm really sad. I'm really angry right now. And it took me a long time to realize I need to articulate that and say that. And someone who can be in that with you for a long time is a blessing. And I think guys especially, because of ideas of weakness and ideas of vulnerability, I think a lot more of us need it. And it's something that he's just such a consistent presence for that's given me freedom to, if I'm down, like I know I have a brother who I can share that I'm down with, and not feel like you're like going to the well too much on it. And so I think that's a grace that for me, as I've been working through how to still trust the Lord, still trust, I have therapists, I do all these other things, but to have a brother who lets me have that proper place of lament and articulation so that my soul isn't burdened with this like dark cloak of isolation has been a beautiful thing for me.
Thanks.
How many times have I almost started crying on this podcast already?
Sorry.
You're going to get me going here. All right. Our fourth daughter was born in 2016, and she was in the NICU for almost a year and a half. Oh, and wow. Then came home and then was back in the PICU. And the Dysons were there for us every single day. I mean, Alicia came and cared for our children, and Deshaun was loving me and caring for me and holding me up in a season I could not be held up. And what he's done is he's given me a place to just be myself. Being a professor and a church elder and things like that, you always have to try to set an example, or you feel like you have to be this or that. And I could always just be with Deshaun and be myself and just be who I am and not worry about judgment, because he has seen me at my lowest and he has seen me at my worst. And he, in the midst of that, has picked me up and cared for me in the midst of that. And it's like this is cliche, but it's like a band of brothers. It's like these guys that have gone to war together and just look at each other differently and think of each other differently. And they've been in the trenches with one another. And the other one looks at the other one and says, hey, when death is here, I'm going to carry you and I'm going to carry your child. And so that's a kind of friendship that the Lord in his grace and in his spirit knits us together in love for one another. That is supernatural, but it's also, I think, our personalities. I think it's our interests. I think it's our humor, the food we like. All these things are a part of our relationship. And man, what's been beautiful is all the things that Deshaun loves and is passionate about that I've come to love and be passionate about, and vice versa. I mean, you see a Star Wars toy behind his shoulder. That would not have happened 3 years ago. So I'm just praising God that he is my best friend. And I thank you that you have a podcast that highlights friendship, particularly for males. I think like that's a huge, huge thing missing in our society. And I think a lot of that are the the fellowship societies and clubs that were so apparent in the latter part of the 20th century, in the 60s and 70s, that men got together and did things together in groups and organizations that have really been destroyed, from fraternities to Lions clubs to Rotary clubs to, I mean, they don't exist, or they're dying out. And I don't know what that means for men in the future, but it's not good.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you guys are birthing real hope here, and it's just such a privilege to spend an hour with you and listen in. Thanks for letting me in, and I really hope to keep in touch.
Thank you, Ann. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for this podcast and your great work.
Thank you so much. And the other podcasts and the writing, all of it's been wonderful.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Person Revolution podcast, which is as much a cultural compass for comment as it is an incarnate witness of the hope we explore in our pages. Like what you heard? Check out this podcast's intellectual seedbed at www.comment.org, where you'll find an artistic rendering of essays that shed light on the very real shadows afflicting the peace of our commons today, but also the many cracks of light. And consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or you can suggest questions that are pressing upon your desire to be an agent of grace and truth and gentleness and trustworthiness. We want to hear from you, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at comment@cardis.ca and expect a sincere exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.